Prince Alexander stood at the window of his London apartment, staring at the photograph in his hands. The image showed his mother, Queen Isabella, 25 years younger, sitting on a simple wooden bench in a Brazilian favela, surrounded by children whose faces beamed with joy despite their circumstances. She wore no crown that day, no elaborate gown, just a simple white dress and the warmest smile he had ever seen on her face. The photograph had been taken during her famous humanitarian mission to Rio de Janeiro in 1998, just months before the tragic car accident that claimed her life. Alexander had been only 12 years old then, too young to fully understand the impact of what his mother was doing, but old enough to see how her eyes lit up whenever she spoke about helping those who had been forgotten by the world. Now, at 37, Alexander finally understood. The weight of responsibility that came with royal blood wasn't about ceremonies or state dinners. It was about using privilege to lift others up. His mother had taught him that through her actions, even if he hadn't grasped it at the time. The letter from the Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs lay open on his desk. They were inviting him to visit the same communities his mother had championed, to see how her legacy had grown and evolved over the decades. The timing felt perfect, almost destined. It would mark exactly 25 years since her last visit to South America. Alexander's personal secretary, Margaret, knocked softly before entering. She had worked for the royal family for over 30 years and had been one of the few people who truly understood the depth of Queen Isabella's commitment to humanitarian causes. "Your Highness, I've received confirmation from the Palace Press Office," Margaret said, her voice carrying a hint of excitement. "They've approved your request for the South American tour. The Prime Minister's office has also given their blessing." Alexander nodded, still holding the photograph. "Margaret, do you remember what she said about this trip? About why she felt compelled to go?" The older woman's eyes softened. She said that royal duty meant nothing if it didn't touch real lives. She believed that sitting in palaces while children suffered was a betrayal of everything the monarchy should represent. The prince turned from the window, his decision crystallizing. "Then, that's exactly what we'll do. We'll retrace her steps, but we won't just visit for photographs. We'll work. We'll listen. We'll make a difference." Over the following weeks, Alexander threw himself into preparation with an intensity that surprised even his closest advisors. He spent hours studying Portuguese, knowing that speaking to people in their own language would show respect in ways that translators never could. He read everything he could find about the current state of the communities his mother had visited, learning about new challenges and ongoing struggles. The favelas of Rio had changed dramatically since 1998. Some had seen remarkable improvements through government programs and international aid, while others faced new problems like drug violence and urban displacement. Alexander wanted to understand all of it before he arrived. His cousin, Princess Charlotte, found him one evening in the palace library, surrounded by books about Brazilian social policy and economic development. She had always been his closest confidant, the one person who understood the peculiar burden of being born into service. "You're taking this very seriously," she observed, settling into the chair across from him. "Mother never did anything halfway," Alexander replied, not looking up from a report about education initiatives in Sao Paulo. "If I'm going to honor her memory, I need to do it properly." Charlotte leaned forward. "Alex, you know this isn't just about recreating a photograph, right? The media will be watching every move you make. They'll compare everything you do to what she did." Alexander finally looked up, and Charlotte was struck by the determination in his eyes. "Good. Let them compare. Let them see that her work didn't die with her." The announcement came on a Tuesday morning. The palace released a simple statement. His Royal Highness Prince Alexander will undertake a humanitarian mission to Brazil and Argentina next month, visiting communities first championed by his late mother, Queen Isabella. The prince will focus on education, healthcare, and youth development initiatives. The media response was immediate and overwhelming. Newspapers ran side-by-side photographs of mother and son, speculating about whether Alexander could capture even a fraction of his mother's magic with people. Some were skeptical, remembering him as the more reserved of Isabella's children. the one who had always seemed more comfortable with duty than with crowds. But those close to Alexander saw something different emerging. The shy boy who had hidden behind his mother's skirts during public appearances was transforming into a man with a clear sense of purpose. He began making unannounced visits to homeless shelters in London, spending hours talking with people about their experiences. He volunteered at a refugee center, learning firsthand about the challenges facing displaced families. Lady Catherine Morrison, the director of the Royal Foundation, watched this transformation with amazement. She had known Alexander since he was a child, and she had never seen him so focused, so driven. He's becoming the person his mother always believed he could be, she confided to her husband one evening. It's as if her death planted a seed that's finally ready to bloom. The palace machinery moved into high gear as the trip approached. Security details were coordinated with Brazilian authorities. Logistics were planned down to the minute. Media accreditation was carefully managed to ensure coverage without chaos. But Alexander insisted on one thing that made everyone nervous. He wanted time away from the cameras. He wanted moments when he could interact with people without the artifice of official photography. He wanted to sit where his mother had sat, to see what she had seen, without the world watching. "The photograph of my mother on that bench," he told his security chief, Commander Roberts. "It was powerful because it was real. She wasn't performing for cameras. She was simply present with people who needed to be seen." Commander Roberts, a veteran of royal protection with over 20 years of experience, understood the security implications of such requests. "Sir, unscheduled interactions create risks we can't always predict or control." "Then we'll manage the risks," Alexander replied firmly. "But we won't eliminate the humanity." 3 days before his departure, Alexander visited his mother's grave at the royal estate. He had been there countless times over the years, but this visit felt different. He carried with him the same photograph that had inspired his journey, along with a letter he had written but never intended to send. Standing before the simple marble headstone, he spoke aloud for the first time about his intentions. "I understand now, Mom. I understand why you felt you had to go, why you had to touch lives that others forgot. I'm going to try to do what you did, but I'm going to do it my way." The wind rustled through the ancient oak trees that surrounded the burial ground, and for a moment, Alexander could almost hear his mother's voice encouraging him forward. She had always believed that true nobility came not from titles or wealth, but from service to others. As he walked back toward the palace, Alexander felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. The path ahead would be challenging. He would face skepticism, criticism, and comparison at every turn. But he was ready. He was ready to honor his mother's memory, not through imitation, but through action. The next morning brought final preparations and last-minute briefings. Maps were reviewed, schedules were confirmed, and equipment was packed. Alexander's luggage was notably simple. Casual clothes suitable for working in communities, comfortable shoes for walking on unpaved streets, and Portuguese language books for last-minute practice. Margaret approached him as he was reviewing his itinerary one final time. "Your Highness, there's something I think you should have." She handed him a small leather journal, worn and well-used. "This belonged to your mother. She kept notes during her travels, thoughts about the people she met, and the things she learned. I thought it might provide guidance when you need it most." Alexander opened the journal carefully. His mother's handwriting filled the pages, describing encounters with children in hospitals, conversations with community leaders, and reflections on the responsibility of privilege. One entry, dated just days before her death, stood out. "True impact comes not from grand gestures, but from genuine connection. When we see people as individuals rather than causes, we honor their dignity and our own humanity." Closing the journal gently, Alexander looked up at Margaret. "Thank you. This means everything." That evening, as London settled into its familiar rhythm of lights and traffic, Prince Alexander stood once again at his apartment window. But this time, he wasn't looking backward at a photograph. He was looking forward toward a journey that would define not just his own legacy, but his understanding of what it meant to carry his mother's work into a new generation. The plane would leave in 18 hours. In less than a day, he would begin walking in his mother's footsteps, carrying her dreams to places where hope had sometimes grown thin. He was ready to discover what those dreams could become in 2023, 25 years after they had first taken root in the favelas of Rio de Janeiro. The humidity hit Prince Alexander like a warm embrace as he stepped off the plane at Rio de Janeiro's Galeão International Airport. The Brazilian sun blazed overhead, and the sounds of Portuguese conversations mixed with the distant rhythm of samba music drifting from somewhere beyond the terminal. This was nothing like the controlled environment of London, and Alexander found himself energized by the chaos and vibrancy that surrounded him. Ambassador Patricia Santos greeted him at the bottom of the aircraft stairs, her warm smile immediately putting him at ease. She had been Brazil's ambassador to the United Kingdom for 3 years and had worked tirelessly to coordinate this visit with both governments. "Your Highness, welcome to Brazil," she said in perfect English, though Alexander surprised her by responding in Portuguese. "Muito obrigado, embaixadora. Estou muito feliz por estar aqui." "Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'm very happy to be here." The ambassador's eyes widened with delight. "Your Portuguese is excellent. The people will appreciate your effort to speak our language." As they walked through the VIP section of the airport, Alexander caught glimpses of the city through the windows. Rio sprawled endlessly in all directions, a mixture of gleaming skyscrapers, lush green mountains, and the famous favelas that climbed the hillsides like colorful mosaics. Somewhere out, there was the bench where his mother had sat, the community she had touched, the people whose lives had been changed by her brief but powerful presence. The motorcade that carried him through Rio's busy streets was smaller than what he would have had in London. Alexander had specifically requested a less formal approach, wanting to be as accessible as possible to the people they would meet. As they wound through the city, he saw Brazil's contrasts in sharp relief. Luxury condominiums stood within sight of sprawling informal settlements, while street vendors sold fresh fruit next to high-end boutiques. Their first stop was the municipal hospital where his mother had visited children suffering from various illnesses in 1998. Dr. Ana Maria Fernandes, the hospital's current director, met them at the entrance. She had been a young nurse during Queen Isabella's visit and remembered that day with vivid clarity. "Your mother saved this hospital," Dr. Fernandes explained as they walked through the pediatric wing. "After her visit, international donations poured in. We were able to build a new cancer treatment center and upgrade all our equipment. But more importantly, she brought attention to the children who had been forgotten by everyone else." They entered a bright, cheerful ward where children were receiving treatment. Unlike the sterile, intimidating environment Alexander had expected, the walls were covered with colorful murals, and toys and books were scattered throughout the common areas. Nurses moved with gentle efficiency, and despite the serious nature of their illnesses, many of the children were laughing and playing. A 7-year-old girl named Sophia approached Alexander with a fearless curiosity that only children possess. She had been receiving treatment for leukemia for 6 months, but her eyes sparkled with life and mischief. "Are you a real prince?" she asked in Portuguese, tugging on his sleeve. Alexander knelt down to her level, remembering how his mother had always made sure to meet children at their eye level rather than looking down at them. "I am," he replied in Portuguese, "but I'm not as important as the brave children I'm meeting today." Sophia giggled and grabbed his hand, leading him toward the playroom where other children were gathered. For the next hour, Alexander forgot about cameras and protocols. He played games, listened to stories, and learned about each child's dreams for the future. One boy wanted to be a soccer player for Brazil's national team. A girl planned to become a doctor so she could help other sick children. Dr. Fernandez watched from the doorway, tears in her eyes. "He has his mother's gift," she whispered to Ambassador Santos. The children respond to him the same way they responded to her. When it was time to leave the hospital, Alexander made an unexpected request. "I'd like to make a personal donation to the hospital," he told Dr. Fernandez. "Not from any official royal fund, but from my own money." "What do you need most?" The doctor was taken aback. Royal visits usually involve photo opportunities and speeches, not personal financial commitments. "We're trying to create a family housing unit," she said slowly, "for families who travel from far away for their children's treatment. They often have nowhere to stay except in the hospital corridors." "Consider it done," Alexander replied immediately. "Send the details to my private secretary, and we'll arrange for the funding." The news of his unplanned donation spread quickly through the hospital staff. By the time they reached the parking area, nurses and doctors had gathered to wave goodbye, many holding signs thanking him in Portuguese and English. Their next destination was the favela of Rocinha, one of the largest informal settlements in South America, and a place his mother had specifically requested to visit during her 1998 trip. As their convoy began the climb up the winding roads into the hillside community, Alexander saw a completely different side of Rio. The narrow streets were crowded with motorcycles, small shops, and children playing soccer with makeshift balls. Colorful houses were built seemingly on top of each other, connected by a maze of staircases and narrow alleys. Music echoed from open windows, and the smell of grilled meat and fresh bread filled the air. Carlos Mendoza, a community leader who had been a teenager during Queen Isabella's visit, met them at the community center. He was now in his 30s, with graying hair and hands calloused from years of construction work, but his eyes held the same passion for his community that had impressed the Queen years earlier. "Your mother changed everything for us," Carlos explained as they walked through the center. "Before she came, nobody cared about Rocinha except to fear us or ignore us. She sat with our children, ate our food, listened to our stories. She made us feel human." The community center that had been just a dream in 1998 was now a thriving hub of activity. Children attended after-school programs while their parents learned job skills in vocational training classes. A small library occupied one corner, filled with donated books in Portuguese and English. Elderly residents gathered for health screenings and social activities. Alexander spent time in each area, talking with people about their daily lives and challenges. He met Maria Santos, a single mother of 3 who had been able to start her own seamstress business after completing training at the center. He spoke with João Silva, a former drug dealer who had turned his life around and now ran youth sports programs to keep other young men off the streets. The most powerful moment came when Carlos led him to a small shrine in the center's main room. Photographs of community members who had died over the years were arranged around a picture of Queen Isabella, surrounded by flowers and candles. "We pray for your mother every week," Carlos said softly. "We pray for all our people who are no longer with us, but we always include her because she was our people too." Alexander stood before the shrine in silence, overwhelmed by the depth of love and respect these people still held for his mother. She had spent only a few hours in their community, but she had left a permanent mark on their hearts. "May I add something?" Alexander asked, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small photograph of his mother that he had carried with him from London. It showed her laughing with his sister during a family picnic, informal and joyful. "She would want you to remember her happy," he said, placing the photo among the others. That evening, Alexander joined a community dinner in Rocinha's main square. Long tables were set up under string lights, and families from throughout the favela came to share food and conversation. The meal was simple: rice, beans, grilled chicken, and fresh vegetables, but it was prepared with love and served with pride. As they ate, children performed traditional Brazilian dances, and older residents told stories about the neighborhood's history. Alexander listened carefully, his Portuguese improving with each conversation. He learned about the daily challenges of life in Rocinha: unreliable electricity, limited access to quality health care, and ongoing concerns about violence from drug trafficking. But he also learned about the community's strengths: strong family bonds, cultural richness, and a determination to create better futures for their children. People shared dreams of education, small businesses, and travel. They spoke about Rocinha not as a place to escape, but as a place to improve. Maria Santos, the seamstress he had met earlier, sat beside him during dinner. "Your mother asked me what I wanted most in the world," she remembered. "I told her I wanted my children to have choices I never had. Now my oldest daughter is studying engineering at university. Your mother's visit started something that changed my family forever." As the evening wound down, Alexander found himself reluctant to leave. The warmth and authenticity of the community stood in stark contrast to the formal world he usually inhabited. Here, people valued him not for his title or wealth, but for his willingness to listen and connect. Carlos walked him back to the convoy, and as they reached the cars, the community leader handed him a small gift, a handmade bracelet woven in the colors of the Brazilian flag. "For your mother," Carlos said. "We made one for her in 1998, but she left before we could give it to her. Will you take this to her grave?" Alexander accepted the bracelet with hands that trembled slightly. The simple gesture embodied everything his mother had taught him about the power of human connection. "I will," he promised, "and I'll make sure she knows that her work here continues." As the motorcade descended from Rocinha back toward the city, Alexander looked out at the lights twinkling across the hillside. Each light represented a family, a story, a dream. His mother had seen this same view 25 years ago, and she had understood that behind every light was someone who deserved to be remembered and valued. Tomorrow would bring new communities, new people, new opportunities to honor his mother's legacy. But tonight, Alexander felt closer to understanding what had driven her to this place, what had compelled her to use her position to shine light on corners of the world that others preferred to ignore. The boy who had hidden behind palace walls was disappearing, replaced by a man who was finally ready to step into his mother's footsteps and make them his own. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Escola Municipal Santos Dumont, a primary school in the Cidade de Deus favela where Prince Alexander would spend his second day in Rio. Unlike the previous day's hospital visit with its controlled environment, this would be his first real test of connecting with an entire community of children and families who had been preparing for weeks for his arrival. Principal Elena Rodriguez had been teaching at the school for 15 years and remembered when it was barely more than a few concrete rooms with broken windows and no proper supplies. Queen Isabella's visit in 1998 had catalyzed a transformation that Elena still considered miraculous. "Before your mother came, we had no library, no computers, no sports equipment," Elena explained as they walked through hallways now bright with children's artwork and educational posters. The children sat on broken chairs at damaged desks, and many couldn't afford basic school supplies. But your mother didn't just visit. She started a scholarship program that still operates today. Alexander paused to examine a display case filled with photographs from the school's history. The contrast was remarkable. Images from the late 1990s showed a struggling institution with few resources, while recent photos displayed modern classrooms, a computer lab, and children engaged in science experiments and art projects. "How many children attend now?" Alexander asked, watching through a window as students played in a newly renovated playground. 467, Elena replied with pride. "And our test scores are now among the highest in the district. 63% of our graduates go on to secondary school, compared to 31% before your mother's visit. The first classroom they entered housed 7-year-olds who were learning to read. The teacher, Miss Carla, had prepared her students for the visit, but nothing could contain their excitement when the prince walked through the door. 25 children jumped to their feet, some hiding behind their desks with shy smiles, others boldly approaching to shake his hand. Alexander had learned from watching his mother's old videos that children responded best to genuine interest rather than formal interaction. He sat cross-legged on the classroom floor, immediately reducing himself to their level and creating an atmosphere of equality rather than hierarchy. "What are your favorite books?" he asked in Portuguese, gesturing toward the classroom library that filled an entire wall with colorful spines. Hands shot up throughout the room. 8-year-old Gabriel proudly announced that he loved stories about astronauts. Ana Maria declared her passion for fairy tales with brave princesses. Little Roberto, who was missing his 2 front teeth, lists that he enjoyed books about animals, especially monkeys like the ones that sometimes wandered down from the nearby forest. Miss Carla brought out a special book that the class had been working on together, a collection of stories written by the children about their dreams for the future. Each page featured a different child's handwriting accompanied by colorful drawings depicting their aspirations. Alexander read each story carefully, asking questions about the details and encouraging the children to expand on their ideas. Maria wanted to become a veterinarian to help street animals. Pedro dreamed of building houses for families who didn't have homes. Sophia planned to become a teacher like Miss Carla, so she could help other children learn to read. Your mother read stories to children in this same room, Miss Carla whispered to Alexander during a quiet moment. She said that education was the greatest gift anyone could give to a child because it opened doors to possibilities they might never have imagined. The children performed a traditional Brazilian song they had been practicing for weeks, their voices blending in harmonies that filled the small classroom with joy. Alexander found himself clapping along, his formal training forgotten in the face of such genuine enthusiasm. When it was time to move to the next classroom, the children didn't want him to leave. They gathered around him with drawings they had made, stories they wanted him to read, and questions about life as a prince. Alexander spent extra time with each child, understanding that for many of them, this might be the only time they would ever meet someone from the world beyond their community. The older students, ages 10 to 12, had prepared a presentation about how education had changed their families' lives. They spoke with remarkable maturity about parents who had learned to read through adult education programs, siblings who had received scholarships to attend university, and grandparents who had started small businesses after completing vocational training. 12-year-old Paolo, whose mother worked as a cleaning lady, stood before the class and spoke about his dream of becoming an engineer. My mother cleans offices and buildings she helped construct when she worked in construction, he said. Someday, I want to design buildings for her to be proud of. Alexander was struck by the determination in these young voices. Despite growing up in challenging circumstances, these children possessed an optimism and work ethic that inspired him. They understood that education represented opportunity, and they were willing to work hard to seize every chance they were given. During lunch break, Alexander joined the children in the school cafeteria, sharing rice, beans, vegetables, and fresh fruit that was provided through a government nutrition program. The meal was simple but nutritious, and Alexander noticed how grateful the children were for food that many people in his world would take for granted. As they ate, children told him stories about their families and neighborhoods. He learned about the strong community bonds that helped families survive difficult times, the local festivals that brought everyone together, and the small businesses that formed the economic backbone of their area. 13-year-old Isabella, named after his mother, approached him shyly during lunch. She carried a worn notebook filled with poems she had written in Portuguese and English. I've been learning English because I want to travel the world someday, she explained. Your mother inspired my grandmother to name me Isabella. Can I read you a poem I wrote about dreams? Alexander nodded encouragingly, and Isabella stood before her classmates to recite a poem about a girl who imagines herself flying over oceans to see distant lands, learning new languages, and bringing stories back to share with her community. Her English was halting but heartfelt, and when she finished, the entire cafeteria erupted in applause. That was beautiful, Alexander told her. Keep writing, keep dreaming, and keep practicing your English. The world needs voices like yours. After lunch, Alexander participated in the school's physical education program, joining a soccer game on the small concrete court behind the main building. The children delighted in discovering that the prince was a decent soccer player, though they quickly proved superior with moves and techniques he had never seen. As they played, Alexander noticed how the game transcended all social boundaries. Here, There were no princes or commoners, no rich or poor, just children laughing, competing, and supporting each other. When he scored a goal, his teammates celebrated as if he had just won the World Cup. When he missed an easy shot, they encouraged him to try again. The afternoon brought a special presentation from the school's teenage volunteer program. Students ages 14 to 16 had been trained as tutors and mentors for younger children, creating a system where success bred more success within the community. 16-year-old Marcus, who had been attending the school since kindergarten, explained how the program worked. "We remember what it felt like to struggle with reading or math," he said. "When we help younger students, we understand their challenges because we face them too." The results were impressive. Test scores had improved across all grade levels, school attendance had increased, and fewer students were dropping out to work or help their families. The older students took pride in their role as leaders and role models, understanding that their success created opportunities for those who would follow. Alexander spent time observing tutoring sessions where teenagers worked patiently with younger children on homework assignments. The bonds between mentor and student were evident in their interactions. Gentle corrections, enthusiastic praise, and shared celebration when concepts finally clicked. As the school day wound down, Alexander gathered with the entire school community in the main courtyard for a closing ceremony. Principal Rodriguez spoke about the legacy of Queen Isabella and how her visit had transformed not just the school, but the entire community's relationship with education. "Your mother showed us that learning is not a privilege for the wealthy," she said. She believed that every child, regardless of their circumstances, deserved access to knowledge and opportunity. That belief became the foundation of everything we've built here. Alexander was invited to speak, and he chose to address the children in Portuguese, wanting his words to reach them directly without the barrier of translation. "Your school is proof that my mother's dreams can become reality," he began. She believed that education could change lives, families, and entire communities. "Looking at all of you today, your curiosity, your determination, your kindness to each other, I know she was right." He paused, looking out at the sea of young faces gazing up at him with attention and respect. "But the real heroes of this story are not my mother or me," he continued. "The heroes are your teachers who work every day to help you learn. The heroes are your parents who sacrifice to keep you in school. The heroes are the older students who take time to help younger ones. And the heroes are all of you because you understand that education is not just about getting good grades. It's about becoming people who can make the world better." The children responded with enthusiastic applause, and many parents who had gathered outside the school to catch a glimpse of the prince found themselves moved to tears by his words. As Alexander prepared to leave, the students presented him with a collective gift, a book containing letters and drawings from every child in the school. Each page expressed gratitude not just for his visit, but for his mother's legacy that continued to impact their daily lives. Principal Rodriguez walked him to his car, carrying a special envelope. "This contains reports on every child who has graduated from our school since your mother's visit," she explained. "Their achievements, their continuing education, their careers. I thought you might want to know the specific impact of her work." Alexander accepted the envelope with reverence, understanding that it contained the true measure of his mother's legacy, not in grand gestures or royal ceremonies, but in the changed trajectories of individual lives. As his convoy pulled away from the school, Alexander looked back to see hundreds of children and teachers waving from the courtyard, their faces bright with the knowledge that their dreams were valued and their futures were worth investing in. Tomorrow would bring new communities and new people to meet, but the lesson of Escola Municipal Santos Dumont would stay with him forever. Education wasn't just about teaching children to read and write. It was about teaching them to believe in themselves and their potential to change the world. The early morning flight from Rio to Sao Paulo gave Prince Alexander time to process the emotional intensity of his first 2 days in Brazil. As the plane climbed over the mountains that surrounded Rio, he opened his mother's journal and read her entries from this same journey 25 years earlier. Her words revealed a woman grappling with the weight of privilege and the responsibility that came with global attention. "I struggle with the brevity of these visits," she had written. "How can I truly understand complex problems in a few hours?" But perhaps the goal isn't complete understanding. Perhaps it's bearing witness, amplifying voices that need to be heard, and using whatever influence I have to ensure these communities aren't forgotten when I leave. Sao Paulo emerged below them as an endless urban sprawl, a city of over 12 million people representing Brazil's economic heart. But Alexander wasn't heading to boardrooms or government offices. His destination was the periphery, the working-class neighborhoods where his mother had chosen to spend her time learning about urban poverty and community resilience. The neighborhood of Capão Redondo in the far south of Sao Paulo looked different from Rio's hillside favelas. Here, rows of small houses stretched for miles, interspersed with community centers, small shops, and busy streets filled with buses and motorcycles. This was where Brazil's industrial workers lived, people who commuted hours each day to jobs in the city center, but who had built vibrant communities in areas others preferred to ignore. Father Miguel Santos met Alexander at the community center that anchored the neighborhood's social services. The priest was in his 60s now, his hair completely gray, but his eyes still held the passion that had impressed Queen Isabella during her visit. He had spent 40 years working in Capão Redondo, watching it transform from an abandoned periphery to a community with its own identity and pride. "Your mother understood something that most visitors miss," Father Miguel explained as they walked through the center's main hall. "She realized that poor communities aren't places where people have given up. They're places where people work harder than anyone else just to survive." The community center buzzed with activity even in the mid-morning. In one room, mothers attended classes on early childhood nutrition while their toddlers played in a supervised area. Another space housed a job training program where adults learned skills like computer repair, accounting, and food service management. A third area served as a health clinic where neighborhood volunteers provided basic medical care and health education. Alexander spent time in each program, talking with participants about their experiences and goals. He met Sandra Oliveira, a 34-year-old mother of 3 who was completing training as a nursing assistant. She had been working as a hotel housekeeper for 8 years, leaving home at 4 in the morning to reach downtown Sao Paulo by 6. "The training program lets me study in the evenings after my children are in bed," Sandra explained. "Next month I'll finish, and I've already been offered a position at the neighborhood clinic. I'll be able to work close to home and help people in my own community." Her story was repeated throughout the center, people using education and training to improve their circumstances while staying connected to the neighborhoods they loved. Alexander was struck by how many participants spoke about wanting to give back to their communities rather than escape from them. In the health clinic, Alexander met Dr. Ana Lucia Pereira, a young physician who had grown up in Capão Redondo and returned after medical school to serve her childhood neighborhood. She had been only 5 years old when Queen Isabella visited, but she remembered the excitement that had rippled through the community. "Your mother's visit convinced a lot of us that our neighborhood mattered," Dr. Pereira explained as she checked on an elderly patient with diabetes. "When someone that important came here, listened to our problems, and treated us with respect, it changed how we saw ourselves." The clinic provided services that would otherwise require expensive trips to distant hospitals. Basic medical care, health screenings, prenatal care, and health education programs. Dr. Pereira had built relationships with specialists willing to volunteer their time, creating a network of care that served thousands of families. Alexander observed a diabetes education class where neighborhood residents learned to manage their condition through diet, exercise, and proper medication. The instructor, a nurse named Carlos who also lived in the area, used humor and practical examples to make complex medical information accessible to people with varying levels of education. "We don't just treat symptoms," Dr. Pereira explained. "We address root causes. Poor nutrition isn't just about bad choices. It's about food access, work schedules, and stress. Our programs try to address all these factors. The afternoon brought Alexander to the community's youth center, a converted warehouse that had been transformed into a space for after-school programs, sports activities, and job training for teenagers. The walls were covered with murals painted by local artists, and the concrete floors had been polished to accommodate basketball and futsal courts. 16-year-old Felipe Santos approached Alexander with a confidence that comes from being surrounded by supportive adults and peers. He had been attending programs at the youth center for 4 years and was now training other younger participants in computer skills and basic programming. "This place saved my life," Felipe said matter-of-factly. "My older brother got involved with drugs because there was nothing else to do after school. But I had this place. I had adults who cared about my future and friends who were working toward goals instead of just hanging out on the street corners." Felipe showed Alexander through the center's computer lab, where teenagers were learning skills that could lead to jobs in Sao Paulo's growing technology sector. Some were building websites for local businesses, others were learning graphic design, and a few were exploring more advanced programming concepts. The youth center's director, Maria Silva, had been a social worker in the neighborhood for 12 years. She explained how the programs were designed not just to keep young people occupied, but to help them develop leadership skills and community connections. "We don't just want them to get good jobs and move away," Maria said. "We want them to succeed and then help the next generation of kids succeed too." The young people who've gone through our programs often come back as volunteer mentors. Alexander participated in a workshop where teenagers were planning a community festival to celebrate local culture and raise money for neighborhood improvements. The event would feature music by local artists, food prepared by neighborhood cooks, and displays showcasing the area's history and achievements. 18-year-old Patricia Lopez was coordinating the festival's educational component, which would include presentations about community history, environmental sustainability, and economic development. She had been accepted to study social work at the University of Sao Paulo, but planned to return to Capão Redondo after graduation. "People think success means leaving your neighborhood behind," Patricia explained. "But real success means having the skills and knowledge to make your community better. Your mother understood that. She didn't try to save us. She tried to support the work we were already doing to save ourselves." As evening approached, Alexander joined a community meeting in the center's main hall. About 60 residents had gathered to discuss ongoing challenges and plan collaborative solutions. The meeting was conducted in Portuguese, but Alexander's language skills had improved enough that he could follow most of the discussion. Residents talked about problems with public transportation, concerns about youth employment, and the need for better infrastructure. But they also celebrated successes: a new small business cooperative that was creating jobs, improvements in local schools, and the declining crime rate that had made the neighborhood safer for families. Father Miguel facilitated the meeting with skill developed over decades of community organizing. He ensured that everyone had a chance to speak, helped the group identify priorities, and guided them toward practical action steps. "Democracy isn't just about elections," he explained to Alexander during a break in the discussion. "It's about people having a voice in the decisions that affect their daily lives." These meetings teach people that their opinions matter and that they can work together to solve problems. Alexander was invited to address the gathering, and he spoke about what he had learned during his 2 days in Brazil. He thanked them for welcoming him into their community and sharing their stories, challenges, and dreams. "My mother believed that every person had something valuable to contribute," he said in Portuguese. "Spending time with all of you has shown me how right she was. You've built something remarkable here, a community where people support each other, where success is measured not just by individual achievement, but by collective progress." The meeting concluded with plans for follow-up actions, committees to address specific issues, volunteers to organize upcoming events, and commitment from various residents to take leadership roles in different initiatives. As Alexander prepared to leave Capão Redondo, Father Miguel walked with him toward his vehicle. The priest had been quiet during the evening's activities, and Alexander sensed he had something important to share. Your mother asked me a question during her visit that I've never forgotten, Father Miguel said. She wanted to know how wealthy people could truly help poor communities without creating dependency or undermining local leadership. Alexander waited for him to continue. I told her then what I'll tell you now. The best help is the kind that makes help unnecessary. Don't give us fish, teach us to fish. But even better than that, recognize that we already know how to fish and help us get access to better fishing equipment and cleaner waters. Father Miguel handed Alexander a small wooden cross carved by a local artisan. Your mother understood that. She used her influence to open doors and create opportunities, but she let communities walk through those doors under their own power. As Alexander's convoy moved through the streets of Sao Paulo toward his hotel, he reflected on the day's experiences. The community of Capao Redondo had shown him what sustainable development looked like. Not external charity creating dependency, but internal capacity building that empowered people to solve their own problems. His mother's journal entry from her Sao Paulo visit had concluded with a promise. I will not allow distance or time to diminish my commitment to these communities. Their struggles are real, but so is their strength. My role is to ensure that strength is recognized and supported. Looking out at the lights of Sao Paulo stretching endlessly in all directions, Alexander understood that he was witnessing the fulfillment of that promise. The communities his mother had visited weren't just surviving. They were thriving, creating models of grassroots development that could inspire change far beyond Brazil's borders. Tomorrow would bring his final day in the country, and with it, the moment he had been anticipating and dreading in equal measure, sitting on the same bench where his mother had posed for the photograph that started his journey. But tonight, he felt ready for that moment, armed with stories and insights that would help him honor her memory while carving out his own path forward. The morning of Prince Alexander's final day in Brazil arrived with an unusual quiet. His schedule included one last community visit before the moment he had traveled thousands of miles to experience, sitting on the wooden bench in Rocinha, where his mother had been photographed 25 years earlier. But first, he would spend time at a women's cooperative that had grown from seeds planted during Queen Isabella's original visit. The Cooperativa das Mulheres Guerreiras, the warrior women's cooperative, occupied a modest building in the Complexo do Alameo, a network of favelas in Rio's North Zone. What had started as an informal group of women sharing sewing skills had evolved into a thriving business that employed over 40 women and supplied goods to stores throughout Rio de Janeiro. Dona Mercedes, the cooperative's founder and president, greeted Alexander at the entrance with the dignity of someone who had built something significant from nothing. At 62, she moved with purpose through the workshop where women operated sewing machines, cutting tables, and packaging stations with the efficiency of a well-run factory. Your mother spent 3 hours with us in 1998, Dona Mercedes explained as they walked through the facility. She didn't just visit. She sat at this same table and learned to embroider. She bought 20 pieces directly from our members and promised to wear one of our scarves at her next public appearance. Alexander paused at a display case containing framed photographs from his mother's visit. The images showed her learning traditional embroidery techniques, laughing with the women, and examining their handmade goods with genuine interest. In one photo, she wore a bright blue scarf created by the cooperative, her smile radiant with the joy of discovery. Did she keep her promise? Alexander asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Dona Mercedes smilat. 3 weeks later, she wore our scarf to a state dinner at Buckingham Palace. The orders started coming in immediately. International buyers, tourists, fashion boutiques. Everyone wanted pieces made by the Queen's seamstresses. The cooperative now produced clothing, accessories, and home goods that were sold throughout Brazil and exported to 12 countries. But more importantly, it had created a model for women's economic empowerment that had been replicated in dozens of other communities. Alexander spent time at each workstation, learning about the production process and talking with the women about their individual stories. He met Clara, a single mother who had been able to buy her own home through her earnings from the cooperative. He spoke with Fatima, who had used her income to send 3 children to university. Rosa showed him the traditional embroidery techniques passed down through generations of women in her family. "We don't just make products," explained Vittoria, a woman in her 30s who served as the cooperative's business manager. "We make opportunities. Every woman who works here becomes a small business owner. They learn financial literacy, leadership skills, and how to plan for their children's futures." The cooperative had expanded beyond its original sewing focus. A corner of the building housed a small bakery where women prepared traditional Brazilian sweets and breads for local restaurants and events. Another area served as a child care center where members' children could stay safely while their mothers worked. Alexander was particularly interested in the cooperative's mentorship program, which paired experienced members with newcomers to teach both technical skills and business knowledge. The program had been inspired directly by Queen Isabella's observation that sustainable development required communities to build their own capacity for leadership and innovation. "Your mother told us that charity creates dependency, but business creates independence," Dona Mercedes recalled. "She encouraged us to think like entrepreneurs, not just craftswomen. That changed everything." The financial records that Vittoria shared with Alexander were impressive. The cooperative had generated over 2 million reais in revenue the previous year, with profits shared among all members based on their contribution of time and skill. More importantly, 93% of women who joined the cooperative were still active members after 2 years, indicating high satisfaction and sustainable income. As the morning progressed, Alexander participated in a planning meeting where members discussed expanding into new product lines and markets. The women approached business decisions with careful analysis and collective wisdom, understanding that their success affected not just themselves, but their families and community. The meeting revealed the cooperative's broader impact on the neighborhood. Members had become community leaders, organizing after-school programs for children, health education workshops for families, and advocacy campaigns for better public services. Economic empowerment had translated into social and political empowerment. When it came time to leave the cooperative, the women presented Alexander with a gift that took his breath away, a replica of the blue scarf his mother had worn to the state dinner, handmade by the same women who had created the original. But this version included an additional element: a small embroidered crown surrounded by the names of all the children and grandchildren whose educations have been funded by their mother's work at the cooperative. "For your mother's grave," Dona Mercedes explained, "so she knows that her investment in us continues to grow." The drive to Rocinha for the afternoon's main event felt different from Alexander's first visit to the favela. This time, he carried with him not just his mother's memory, but 4 days of experiences that had shown him how her work had rippled through communities in ways she could never have imagined. Carlos Mendoza met him at the community center, but instead of immediately proceeding to the famous bench, he led Alexander on a walking tour of improvements that had been made since his last visit. A new health clinic had opened, staffed by doctors and nurses who lived in the community. A computer lab provided internet access and technology training for residents of all ages. A small library offered books in Portuguese and English, including a special section dedicated to Queen Isabella's humanitarian work. "We wanted you to see everything before you sit where she sat," Carlos explained, "because that bench isn't just a place where she rested, it's a symbol of everything that grew from her decision to see us as people worth knowing." As they walked through Rocinha's narrow streets, Alexander was struck by the number of people who recognized him and called out greetings. Children who hadn't been born during his mother's visit waved from windows. Elderly residents emerged from their homes to shake his hand and share memories of the Queen. The bench itself sat in a small plaza overlooking a section of the favela where new construction was evident. The original wooden structure had been reinforced and maintained, surrounded by flowering plants, and a small plaque commemorating Queen Isabella's visit. It faced the same view she had seen, a maze of colorful houses climbing the hillside, with glimpses of Rio's beaches and Christ the Redeemer statue in the distance. A small crowd had gathered in the plaza, but at Alexander's request, they maintained a respectful distance. This moment needed to be personal before it became public. Alexander sat slowly on the bench, feeling the weight of 25 years of history and expectation. He pulled out his mother's journal and read her final entry from Brazil. I cannot solve the problems I've seen here, but I can ensure they are not ignored. I can use whatever influence I have to create opportunities for people to solve their own problems. I can bear witness to their strength and share their stories with those who have power to make a difference. As Alexander sat quietly, children from the community began to approach tentatively. Unlike the organized visits to schools and hospitals, this was spontaneous and unscripted. A little girl offered him a flower she had picked. A boy showed him a drawing of the famous photograph he had copied from school textbook. Carlos sat beside him on the bench, and together they watched the rhythm of daily life continue around them. Women hanging laundry on lines stretched between buildings. Men playing dominoes at a nearby table. Teenagers walking home from school, their uniforms bright against the colorful backdrop of the favela. Your mother asked me what I wanted most for this community, Carlos remembered. I told her I wanted our children to have choices, to be able to stay and improve the neighborhood, or to leave and succeed in the wider world, but either way know that their home was a place of dignity and possibility. Alexander looked around at the evidence of that dream becoming reality. Young adults who had grown up in Rocinha were now teachers in its schools, nurses in its clinics, and leaders in its community organizations. Others had used education and training to build careers in downtown Rio, but maintained strong connections to their childhood community. She kept her word, Alexander said quietly. Everything she promised, everything she started, it's all still here, still growing. As the afternoon sun began to cast longer shadows across the plaza, Alexander knew it was time for the formal photograph that would complete his pilgrimage. But he also knew that the real purpose of his journey had already been fulfilled through the relationships he had built, the stories he had heard, and the understanding he had gained about sustainable development and human dignity. The photographer captured images of Alexander sitting on the bench, but the most powerful photos were those taken spontaneously. The prince surrounded by children, listening intently to an elderly woman's story, participating in a community discussion. These images would tell the story not of a royal seeking publicity, but of a son honoring his mother's legacy by continuing her work. As evening approached, Alexander made one final stop before leaving Rocinha. He visited the shrine in the community center where his mother's photograph was displayed among those of other community members who had passed away. He added the blue scarf from the women's cooperative to the memorial, along with a handwritten note in Portuguese. For my mother, with gratitude from the communities that remember her love. The flight back to London gave Alexander time to process everything he had experienced. The 4 days in Brazil had shown him that his mother's work lived on not in monuments or formal programs, but in the daily lives of people who had been touched by her presence and inspired by her example. He opened a notebook and began writing his own journal entry, documenting not just what he had seen, but what he had learned about leadership, service, and the responsibility that came with privilege. His mother had shown him, through her example, that true nobility came not from titles or ceremonies, but from the willingness to use whatever platform you had been given to amplify voices that needed to be heard. As London appeared below the aircraft, Alexander felt a sense of completion and beginning simultaneously. He had honored his mother's memory by walking in her footsteps, but he had also discovered his own path forward. The communities he had visited in Brazil had given him something precious, a clear understanding of how he could use his position to make a meaningful difference in the world. The photograph of his mother sitting on that bench in Rocinha would always be special to him, but it would no longer be a symbol of something lost. It had become a symbol of something continuing, a commitment to service that had passed from mother to son and would continue rippling through communities around the world for generations to come. 3 weeks later, Alexander announced the establishment of the Queen Isabella Foundation, dedicated to supporting community-led development projects in underserved areas around the world. The foundation's first grants went to the hospital in Rio, the school that had inspired him, the Women's Cooperative, and the Youth Center in Sao Paulo. But more importantly, it committed to a new model of philanthropy, one that listened before speaking, supported rather than directed, and measured success not by money donated but by local leadership developed. The boy who had once hidden behind palace walls had finally stepped fully into the light, carrying his mother's torch into a future bright with possibility and purpose.